Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Oates, and welcome to my presentation summarizing and reviewing Piracy, the Intellectual Property Wars from Gutenberg to Gates by Adrian Johns. As the title suggests, Piracy explores the history of piracy from the invention of the printing press through later technological advancements, including medicines, various types of machinery, vinyl records, radio transmissions, cable, home video, and finally, the Internet. Johns also explores how ideas of literary and intellectual property and copyright evolved as these technologies proliferated throughout the Anglophone world. Across 17 chapters, Johns presents a series of case studies in technological order demonstrating the evolution of intellectual property and piracy in Great Britain and the United States. He begins with a general history of piracy before continuing into the history of stationers' registers in London that allowed printers to claim ownership over written works. He also explores how medicine has been a frequent target of piracy, using Nehemiah Grew's tortuous process of trying to prove that he invented Epsom salt as a treatment for various maladies in the late 1600s as a prime example. Johns also examines controversies surrounding the unauthorized reproductions of the first kaleidoscope and how the advent of radio fundamentally changed modern definitions of piracy and the implications that this new understanding had for vinyl records, television, home video, and finally, the Internet. Johns does not present his argument through the lens of any one theoretical framework. Instead, his case studies demonstrate that the history of piracy is a history of repetition, with the key players and technologies being recasted in each generation while still following the same general script. Thus, a general quote-unquote theory of piracy can be extracted, demonstrating that the practice is one born out of aggressive capitalism. First, piracy tends to flourish on the frontiers of new technology. As new technologies arise, so too do questions of authenticity and ownership. It can often be difficult for the layperson to recognize the authentic from the spurious. This is exemplified early in the book, when Johns recounts how spurious sequels to Don Quixote prompted the novel's real author, Miguel de Cervantes, to write a true sequel to the novel that lampooned the issue of piracy and reprinting. In this sequel, the titular Don Quixote comes to learn of the false sequels to his exploits, and sets out on a new quest to correct the record and comes into contact with people who read the spurious second volume. The invention of the kaleidoscope was also fraught with inauthentic copies of the original, resulting in poorly built devices that prompted the original inventor, Sir David Brewster, to publish guides on how to properly make and operate a kaleidoscope. Monopolies tend to rise in the wake of new technologies. Enterprising individuals and organizations act quickly to dominate the markets created by a new technology. In Elizabethan England, booksellers and printers were one single entity, and these shops took advantage of a register system that operated on a first-come, first-served basis, in which the first shop to claim rights to written works by writing their claim to ownership in a stationer's register would exclusively own that work. This system ultimately collapsed in the wake of the Glorious Revolution, but it was replaced with other methods of patenting and copywriting that upheld the notions of literary and later intellectual property. However, the democratization of technologies presents challenges to the monopolies. The growing ubiquity of the new technology transforms it into a hobby and even a home enterprise. As Johns notes, print pirates worked out of London's houses in the 17th century. Sheet music pirates dealt out their copies of popular songs by the thousands from the terrace houses over Liverpool and Manchester in the 1900s. And listener pirates could be detected in their homes listening to pirated radio sets in the 1920s. Pirates produce cheaper versions of products offered by monopolies. Quote, the public sees nothing wrong in doing business with them. Their publicity, after all, speaks of a mainstream industry that is monopolistic and exploitative of artists and public alike. Piracy is almost always a question of perspective. As Johns notes, those who have historically been called pirates repudiated the label as inaccurate and unjust. In his research, Johns found that the term piracy was first used in reference to intellectual theft and reprinting in the late 1600s in the wake of Britain's Glorious Revolution, going so far as to claim that the nature and existence of copyright reflects the fact that it was born in the generations after the Revolution. The Revolution popularized the principles of property and liberty in modern society, but in the publishing world, these two concepts would clash with each other. London's booksellers would champion books as property, but their critics would argue that ownership of literary ideas and works was monopolistic and tyrannical, a violation of individual liberties and a threat to free thought. Both the booksellers and the reprinters accused each other of piracy. The American colonies were a major market for Scottish and Irish print pirates to sell their wares, and the reprinting of materials from Britain jump-started the American publishing industry. In the wake of the Stamp Act and the lead up to the Revolution, the very act of reprinting London's books was an act of defiance. The smaller, cheaper, portable American versions of London's books came to symbolize a dispersed republic instead of a centralized aristocracy. Developments in America inspired new dreams of Irish independence and autonomy across the pond. Because the reprinting of publications was common practice in foreign countries, the act of reprinting British materials in Ireland came to symbolize Irish autonomy and made publications accessible to poor, rural Catholic citizens by stealing from the rich urban Protestants. While pirates and their critics danced to the same tune for centuries, the advent of radio fundamentally changed the nature of the game. In early 20th century Britain, broadcast licenses were required to own and operate radio sets, but the law was regularly flouted by British citizens. As a result, for the first time, the definition of piracy was broadened to include the illicit reception of information in addition to its unauthorized reproduction. This would inform legal and cultural conversations about piracy for decades to come, especially regarding television, home video, and ultimately the internet. Today, piracy is frequently centered around the copying and distribution of entertainment media such as television shows, movies, and video games. It is estimated that about 127 billion episodes of American television are pirated on the internet each year. As media conglomerates continue to monopolize the entertainment industry, piracy is being used to flout accumulating monthly subscription fees and preserve works of art and entertainment. It is likely that the coming decades will challenge our ideas of intellectual property and ownership as the ideals of capitalism and a free and open internet continue to collide. All of the reviews that I have found have praised the depth and breadth of John's research. Alex Chizar calls the book, quote, remarkable in the depth of its research and the motifs it weaves through its case studies, although he does criticize John's choice to focus on the Anglophone world, asking, quote, can a general history of piracy afford to focus so resolutely on the particular British, here extended to Anglo-American case? This mirrors my own thoughts very well, because while it makes sense to focus on the Anglophone world regarding piracy, seeing how American ideas of copyright were largely imported from Britain, it is apparent that a wider international phenomenon is being ignored, especially since Johns opens the book with a brief accounting of the piratical duplication of a Japanese tech company, NEC. Claire Pettit says that it is, quote, hard to take a strong message from piracy, ultimately declaring that it is a book, quote, whose whole ends up being less than the sum of its parts. The micropolitics of each historical section are assiduously researched, but the book lacks a macropolitics. I find myself somewhat in agreement because I do think that a general model of piracy can be extracted from Johns' work. But while he goes to a great depth to immerse the reader in the legal, cultural, and philosophical minutiae of each case study, it can be difficult to synthesize that model from the ideas presented in the book into a true general history of intellectual piracy. And here I have to confess that Johns goes down so many rabbit holes throughout each of his case studies that it is very easy to miss the forest for the trees, so to speak. His writing is so granular and detail-oriented that it is quite challenging to create any summary of this book that does it justice. And thank you everyone for listening to this presentation, and I really look forward to the discussions that we're going to have about piracy, both historically and in the modern day. Thank you very much, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your semester.